The wind howled through the desolate ruins of what was once a thriving border town. Aria Hale, perched atop a crumbling wall, adjusted her scope, her breath visible in the frigid air. Operation Frostline had gone horribly wrong. What was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission, gather intel and withdraw before dawn, had turned into a nightmare. Hostile forces had anticipated their move, and Aria's team was now pinned down, fighting for survival in the desolate urban jungle of collapsed buildings and rubble. Her mind was clear. There was no panic, only the sharp focus of a sniper. The radio crackled to life. "White Viper, what's your count?" The voice, strained with urgency, belonged to Mason, the team leader. 7 hostiles in the North Quadrant, 4 more moving through the warehouse ruins. Aria replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. A crack of gunfire echoed through the cold air. "We're falling back to extraction, now," Mason ordered, a note of panic creeping into his tone. Aria's eyes remained fixed on the moving targets through her scope. She saw the problem Mason couldn't. If they followed the extraction route he'd chosen, they'd walk straight into a deadly crossfire. Her heart rate remained steady as she made her decision. "Mason, you need to fall back," she repeated, but the radio crackled with more frantic orders from him. She knew what was coming, the cold, dismissive tone, the same tone he used when she offered suggestions that contradicted his plans. The same tone he had used every time he dismissed her input, simply because she was a woman on a team of men. Aria shifted her position, moving swiftly through the ruins, her footsteps muffled by the thick snow underfoot. She was 50 meters from the landing zone when the first shots rang out. One of Mason's men went down, screaming. In an instant, Aria dropped to the ground, her rifle steady in her hands. Through the scope, she saw the shooter. A clean shot, her finger squeezed the trigger, the bullet finding its target with surgical precision. "Viper, clear," a voice shouted. Aria rose, moving toward the extraction point, but the sound of the helicopter's rotor blades drew nearer. She could see Mason and his team scrambling to board, dragging their wounded. She was almost there, only 30 meters away, when the building to her left exploded with gunfire. Aria threw herself to the ground, the air thick with the sounds of battle. Her radio buzzed with chaos. "Get out of there, now!" The panic in Mason's voice was unmistakable. She raised her head, just enough to see the extraction helicopter, barely 20 meters away. She began to sprint, but as she reached the landing zone, everything froze. The helicopter was lifting off. The roar of the rotors drowned out the world. She watched, her fingers reaching for the sky as the helicopter ascended into the snowstorm, leaving her behind. "No," she screamed, but her voice was lost in the wind. A burst of pain exploded in her chest as an RPG hit the wall behind her, throwing her body against the frozen ground. Her helmet cracked. The world went dark. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own heartbeat, slow and fading. Aria's world returned in fractured pieces, pain, cold, and a harsh, biting wind. Her body felt numb, her limbs stiff, but the raw, burning ache of her shoulder told her she was still alive. She blinked against the blinding whiteness of the snowstorm, her head spinning as she tried to push herself upright. The taste of blood filled her mouth. She could barely remember what had happened, only that she had been left behind, abandoned in the heart of enemy territory. Snow and ice clung to her skin, already beginning to freeze over. Her rifle, once a steady companion, was nowhere to be seen, lost in the explosion. She tried to sit up, her left shoulder screaming in protest, but the sharp, searing pain in her ribs brought her back to the ground. She could still move her toes. That was something. Barely 20 feet away, she heard the muffled voices of soldiers moving through the ruins, the enemy forces sweeping the area. They thought she was dead. The enemy soldiers, their voices carrying through the storm, laughed about their victory, discussing how they'd killed the American sniper. Aria clenched her jaw, refusing to let her weakness show. She had to move, to escape before they came back, before the cold, the pain, or worse, the enemy claimed her life. She had no rifle, no backup, only her training to guide her. Her leg was pinned beneath a heavy slab of concrete, but it was nothing she couldn't handle. She gritted her teeth and began the slow, agonizing task of freeing herself. The concrete slab, cold and unyielding, shifted only an inch despite her best efforts. The pain in her shoulder flared, a hot wire tearing through muscle, her vision blurred, but she fought through it, determined. Finally, the slab moved, her leg sliding free. She could feel the blood rush back into her body. And the pain, the real pain, came crashing in, but she didn't have time to rest. Every second was precious. Arya crawled across the frozen landscape, using the wreckage of buildings as cover, moving like a shadow. The enemy was still out there. They were looking for survivors. She could hear the crunch of boots in the snow, the rustling of gear as they searched the area. She had to be smarter than them. She had to be invisible. As she moved deeper into the wreckage, she found a safe corner to hide, catching her breath. Her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't afford it. Not yet. Not while the enemy was still hunting. The snowstorm provided some cover, but it also made her vulnerable. She had to find shelter, a place to regroup before nightfall. The storm was intensifying, the temperature plummeting. She checked the sky. The sun was sinking, and with it, the temperature would drop even further. She needed to move. She couldn't afford to freeze to death in the open. Arya pressed her back against a half-collapsed wall, trying to gauge her surroundings. The remains of the town stretched before her, a cold, desolate landscape of wreckage and death. Her breathing steadied as she focused, calculating her next move. She needed to find shelter, warmth, and time to tend to her injuries. She had 3 hours before the storm would take the last bit of warmth from her body. 3 hours. She couldn't waste a second. The enemy was still out there, but so was she. And for the first time since the helicopter left her behind, she allowed herself a moment to feel the fire of survival burning within her. She was alive, and she would stay that way. Arya's every movement was deliberate, slow, calculated. She could feel the blood pooling beneath her ribs, the pain radiating through her left shoulder, but there was no time to focus on it. Survival was a razor-thin line, and the further she ventured into the ruins, the clearer that line became. The air was biting, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Her body, though battered, moved with a practiced efficiency. She was trained for this. Her mission had always been survival, even when it seemed impossible. As she navigated the snow-swept streets, a familiar sensation washed over her. An instinct that every operator knew, the feeling of being hunted. The enemy had to be close now, sweeping the area systematically. Arya could hear their muffled voices carried on the wind, though she didn't dare risk peeking out from the cover of the debris. She had learned to become a ghost in the fog of war, to blend into the environment until she was nothing more than a shadow. She found herself in what seemed like an old factory compound. Twisted metal beams jutted from the snow, remnants of a once thriving industrial site now reduced to rubble. The silence here was different, a stillness that felt unnatural. She moved quietly, knowing that any sound, any misstep could cost her everything. A sudden sharp noise, a bark, cut through the frozen air, and Arya froze. Dogs. The enemy had brought dogs. It was only a matter of time before they tracked her down. She could hear them, their excited barking growing louder. She had to move. The factory's layout presented an opportunity. Piles of broken machinery and steel beams formed a chaotic but functional labyrinth. Arya quickly calculated her next move. She darted towards the far side of the building, her breath coming in shallow bursts, and slipped into a narrow space between two large, overturned containers. The dogs were getting closer, their barking echoing through the snow. They would be on her in minutes if she didn't act. She crouched low, moving swiftly through the tangled mess of wreckage, using every corner, every shadow as cover. The wind howled around her, and for a moment she considered stopping, just resting, letting the storm pass. But she couldn't. She couldn't afford it. Not here, not now. The sounds of the dogs barking were now accompanied by the voice of one of the handlers, calling commands in Russian. They were getting too close. She had no rifle, no gear, just her sidearm and her knife. She reached into her pack, pulling out a flashbang grenade she had scavenged from the initial chaos. It was a last resort, a way to disrupt the search long enough for her to escape. Carefully, she set it up, securing it in the rubble. Her hands trembling from the cold and pain. She rigged it to a tripwire, using the fragile debris around her as cover. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prepared for the worst. The dogs were nearly upon her. The handlers' voices were now in the immediate vicinity. The tension built to an unbearable crescendo. She held her breath as one of the dogs passed, just a few feet away, the animal's nose almost brushing the dirt beneath her. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she triggered the tripwire. The explosion of light and sound was deafening. The dogs yelped, disoriented, while the handlers shouted in panic. Arya didn't wait. She scrambled from her hiding place and bolted towards the edge of the factory, slipping through the narrow gaps in the crumbling walls. She could hear the chaos behind her, the men shouting, the dogs barking, the distant crash of falling debris. She was moving faster now, adrenaline coursing through her veins, propelling her forward. As she emerged into the open, she could see the lights of the enemy vehicles in the distance. The hunt was on. But Arya wasn't done yet. She had evaded them once, and she would do it again. The storm, once a threat, had become her ally. The cover of snow and darkness would give her the chance she needed to slip through their grasp. She just had to keep moving, and she did. But as she moved further into the wild terrain beyond the town, her body began to betray her. Blood loss, exhaustion, and the freezing cold were taking their toll. Arya stumbled, but forced herself to her feet. No matter the cost, she would keep moving. She had no other choice. The cold was a constant, unrelenting force, gnawing at Arya's bones as she trudged through the snow-covered landscape. The night was dark, the wind howling with increasing ferocity as the storm intensified. Her body, bruised and battered from the explosion, screamed in protest with every step. Her ribs felt like they might break with each shallow breath, and her left shoulder throbbed with a deep, burning pain that she could no longer ignore. The landscape around her was desolate. Endless snow, broken buildings, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving border town. But the storm was her ally now. It masked her movements, covered her tracks, and slowed the enemy's pursuit. Yet she knew that wouldn't last forever. The enemy was still out there, hunting for her. The dogs had been a clear warning. She had to keep moving, keep ahead of them. If she stopped, if she slowed down, they would find her. She could feel the blood seeping from her injuries, growing colder as the night deepened. Hypothermia was setting in, but she pushed the thought aside. She had one mission: survive. Arya paused for a moment, leaning against a frozen steel beam. Her eyes scanned the horizon. There was no sign of movement. The last thing she needed was to be caught in the open. She could still hear the echoes of the dogs barking faintly in the distance. They hadn't given up on her yet. She was their prey, and they would not stop until they found her. But Arya had always been a predator too. It was just a matter of time before she turned the tables. A flash of movement caught her eye, shadows in the distance, moving slowly, methodically. Enemy patrols. She crouched low, blending into the snow, using every scrap of cover the ruined town had to offer. She could hear the crunch of boots in the snow as the soldiers passed within meters of her position. Her heartbeat quickened, but she remained still, breathing softly, waiting. The enemy was close, too close. She could see the faint silhouettes of the soldiers moving under the dim light of the storm. The wind had picked up, the snow falling heavier, but she knew the scent of danger. She could feel their presence like a sixth sense. The soldiers stopped just ahead, murmuring among themselves in Russian, unaware that she was right there, just out of sight. Arya gritted her teeth and held her breath, watching the enemy move past her position. She didn't dare make a sound, not even the slightest shift. For what seemed like hours, they searched the area, circling the perimeter, but Arya remained hidden, a ghost in the storm. Eventually they moved on. She exhaled slowly, her body aching from the tension. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had survived this encounter, and that was what mattered. She began to move again, carefully, deliberately, her mind calculating her next steps. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the team that had left her behind, the ones who had abandoned her without a second thought. Mason's face flashed in her mind, his cold order echoing in her ears, leave her behind. She didn't know why it hurt so much. She had been trained to accept the harsh realities of war. But this was different. She had trusted them, and they had let her down. Anger simmered beneath her exhaustion, but she buried it. Anger wouldn't help her survive. The storm was her only ally now. She needed to keep moving, keep her mind focused. She would make it. She had to. The next few hours passed in a blur of snow and ice, each step heavier than the last. Her strength was waning, but she kept going. And then, finally, she spotted it, an old abandoned building. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered. She stumbled toward it, barely able to keep her eyes open. The door was half off its hinges, and the interior was dark, cold, and empty. She didn't care. It was shelter. It was warmth, even if only for a moment. Arya collapsed inside, her body too weak to stand any longer. She pulled herself into a corner, using what little strength she had left to pull her torn jacket closer around her. Her thoughts drifted, and for a moment she let herself rest. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in hours, she felt safe, even if just for a fleeting moment. But she couldn't stay here forever. The storm might hide her now, but it wouldn't last. Neither would her body if she didn't find help soon. Her body screamed in pain, and the cold gnawed at her skin. She had to keep going. She had to survive. There was no other option. The hours passed, but Arya couldn't afford the luxury of rest for long. As the storm outside intensified, so did the pain inside her. The shelter she had found was no more than a hollow shell, offering some temporary refuge, but it was no match for the cold creeping into her bones. She could feel the effects of frostbite starting to set in on her fingertips and toes. Her ribs, still cracked from the explosion, ached with every shallow breath, and the deep throbbing in her shoulder was becoming unbearable. She knew that if she stayed here much longer, the cold would claim her. She had no choice but to keep moving. The decision was a hard one, but it was the only choice she had. She staggered to her feet, her legs weak from the long journey, but she forced herself to keep moving. The air was thick with snow, and her visibility was reduced to only a few meters. Every step was a challenge, each one bringing her closer to collapse. But Arya refused to stop. She had been left for dead once, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. The storm was her ally, but the enemy was still out there, and they would be looking for her. The footprints she had left in the snow earlier would be easy to follow. She had to lose them, had to get far enough away so that she could disappear. Her only option now was to find cover outside the search radius, maybe an old factory or an abandoned house, something to keep her hidden for the night. She gritted her teeth, pushing forward. The wind howled, biting at her exposed skin, and her strength was fading. But then, as she rounded a corner of a collapsed building, she saw it, an old, half-destroyed structure, its walls cracked and uneven. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. She made her way inside, finding an opening in the wall. The interior was as cold as the rest of the town, but it offered some protection from the relentless wind. Arya collapsed inside, grateful for the shelter, even if it was temporary. She pulled herself into a corner, leaning against the crumbling wall. Her vision was blurry from exhaustion, and her body felt like it was slowly shutting down. She was alive, but for how much longer? She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself rest, even if just for a few minutes. When she opened them again, the reality of her situation hit her with a fresh wave of urgency. She couldn't stay here long. The enemy would be sweeping the area, and if they found her, there would be no second chances. She had to get out of there, had to keep moving. But where? The thought of Mason, of the team who had left her behind, burned through her mind. They hadn't just abandoned her, they had left her to die. Her breath caught in her throat. The betrayal hurt more than any of her physical injuries, but there was no time for that now. She had to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to let her emotions cloud her judgment. Arya forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her. The pain in her shoulder flared again, but she gritted her teeth and ignored it. She had one goal, to survive, and she wouldn't let anything stop her. As she stumbled out of the ruin, she scanned the horizon. The snowstorm still raged, but she could see a faint outline of movement in the distance. It wasn't the enemy, it was something else, something alive. A light, faint but steady, glowed in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It could be a camp, or maybe just another traveler. Whatever it was a sign of life. It was a chance. And Arya wasn't about to let it slip away. She adjusted her gear, checking her sidearm, and made her way toward the light. The storm was no longer her biggest threat. It was the enemy who had left her for dead, and now it was time for her to make them pay. The wind had slowed, but the snow still fell in thick, heavy sheets. Arya moved through the frozen landscape, the weight of her injuries pulling at her every step. But the flicker of light in the distance pushed her forward. Her mind was sharp, despite the exhaustion and pain. She knew she had to stay low, stay hidden. The last thing she needed now was to be spotted by enemy patrols. Her fingers were stiff, but she clenched her sidearm tighter, her only remaining weapon. The light was closer now, but she still couldn't make out what it was. Was it another trap, a hostile unit, or was it the faintest hope of rescue? She couldn't take any chances. As she approached, her eyes narrowed, scanning the area. She could hear the sound of muffled voices, but they were distant. Cautious, she crept closer, moving silently through the snow, using the broken terrain as cover. The building loomed ahead, half destroyed, much like the others. But this one had a fire burning inside, dim but steady. Her heart raced as she closed the gap. Could it be another survivor? Could someone else have made it through the chaos? As she slipped around a crumbling wall, she saw the source of the light, a small campfire surrounded by figures huddled close to the warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the decision she had to make. Should she approach? Or should she stay back, observe? She needed to be sure. Arya crept closer, careful not to make a sound. She could now make out the voices more clearly. They were speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but the tone was calm, almost too calm. She was still too far to make out their faces, but the firelight flickered off metal, rifles, military gear. They were soldiers, and not enemy soldiers, if the gear was any indication. As she edged closer, one of the figures stood up, stretching. Arya froze, her breath shallow as she stayed perfectly still. The figure turned slightly, scanning the horizon. The figure was taller than most, their movements deliberate, not as careless as an enemy patrol. Arya's instincts kicked in. These men weren't Russian, they weren't hostile forces. She was almost certain, but it wasn't safe to assume. Not yet. The figure turned back to the campfire, and Arya took that moment to move closer. She was within range now, and with a careful step, she moved toward the shadows of the camp, her heart pounding in her chest. She could make out their voices now, low murmurs. They were discussing something in tactical terms. Arya's training immediately told her these men weren't part of the enemy forces. She could sense the difference. Still, she was cautious. Trust was a dangerous thing to give, especially in these circumstances. She needed information. She needed to know who they were. She reached into her bag, pulling out the small handheld radio. It was a long shot, but maybe she could get some signal. She found a small patch of open ground and crouched low, hidden from view. The cold gnawed at her, but her focus remained sharp. After a few seconds, the radio crackled to life, a faint signal. The static was heavy, but the voice on the other end was clear enough. "Viper, this is command. Do you copy?" Arya's breath caught in her throat. The radio call was unmistakable, Commander Rowan's voice. She almost couldn't believe it. "Viper here. Command, do you read me?" Her voice was hoarse but strong. The response was immediate. "We've got you, Viper. Hold tight. We're en route." The relief that washed over her was overwhelming, but she couldn't afford to show it. "Understood," she replied. "I'm at the location. Some kind of camp. Don't know who they are yet." Rowan's voice came back quickly. "Stay where you are. We're only minutes away. We'll confirm their identity. Hold position." Arya's pulse quickened as the weight of the situation hit her all at once. They were here. The SEALs, Rowan and his team. They were here, and they were coming for her. The enemies that had left her to die were about to learn what it meant to abandon the White Viper. She could feel the fire of determination building inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back, and she would make sure everyone knew it. She stayed low, hidden, as the figures by the campfire grew closer. Her fingers tightened on her sidearm, ready for whatever came next. She wasn't alone anymore. Minutes passed in a tense silence, the only sound the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath Arya's boots. The faint glow of the campfire flickered in the distance, but her attention remained fixed on the radio in her hand. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she had to remain calm. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not with help so close. Every move had to be precise. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, the ruined town stretching out in front of her, its skeletal remains illuminated by the dim glow of the fire. The enemy soldiers were still out there, but Arya was certain they hadn't spotted her yet. She held her breath, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. a figure moving through the snow, coming toward her position. Instantly, she dropped to her knees, her rifle raised, ready to engage. But as the figure drew closer, she saw the insignia on their uniform, a familiar emblem she hadn't expected to see in this place. It was Rowan's team. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Slowly, cautiously, she stood up from her crouch, her hand still gripping her sidearm as she stepped forward to meet them. The figure approaching her was tall, his face obscured by a helmet and goggles, but there was no mistaking the SEAL team insignia. As he drew closer, the recognition hit her. Commander Blake Rowan, his eyes scanning the area with a calm, professional focus. "Viper," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. "You made it." Arya nodded, her throat tight with relief. "I didn't have much of a choice." Rowan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I'll give you that. You certainly know how to survive." His voice held the respect of someone who had seen the worst, who understood what it meant to endure. "We've got you now. No more running." Arya felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as the reality of the situation set in. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't abandoned. For the first time since the helicopter had left her, she could breathe. But there was still work to be done. "What now?" Arya asked, her voice steady. Rowan looked back at his team, a group of men who had been silently positioning themselves around her, securing the area. "We finish what we started. We gather intel, disrupt their operations, and then we take down the bastards who left you for dead." His eyes met hers, a fire burning in them that matched her own. "And we make sure they don't get away with it." The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle. She had spent days fighting for survival, but now with Rowan's team at her side, she was no longer just fighting to stay alive. She was fighting for justice, for the truth, for the men who had abandoned her. And she would make sure Mason and his team understood that there were consequences for leaving a soldier behind. "You ready?" Rowan asked, his voice steady, filled with that same calm determination that had carried him through countless missions. Arya didn't hesitate. "Ready," she replied, her voice firm. "Let's finish this." As they moved through the wreckage of the town, Arya felt the weight of her journey. The pain, the betrayal, the fight for survival slowly lift. The storm raged around them, but it no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a challenge, one that they would face together. With Rowan and his team at her side, Arya knew that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was going to make sure the enemy knew who the White Viper was, and she wasn't going down without making them pay. The storm had settled into a heavy silence, the only sound the crunch of boots in the snow, as Arya and Rowan's team moved through the ruins. The world around them was an eerie stillness, the snow blanketing the broken landscape like a shroud. Arya's mind was focused, her body moving on pure instinct, her sidearm at the ready, the M210 sniper rifle now securely slung across her back. The SEAL team moved with military precision, their training evident in every step. They didn't need to speak to communicate. Rowan, as always, was at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon, his posture tense but controlled. Arya's pulse quickened, the anticipation of what was to come weighing on her. Her betrayal by Mason and the team had lit a fire inside her, one that had only grown as the days had passed. She had endured the pain, the isolation, the harsh conditions, but now, with her purpose clear, she would make sure the men who had abandoned her would answer for their actions. As they approached the enemy's forward operating base, Arya's mind replayed the events leading up to this moment. The betrayal, the hours of fighting for survival, the men who had chosen to abandon her. Mason's face flashed in her mind, his cold expression as he ordered her team to leave her behind. But that was in the past. Now she was back, and she had the means to make them pay. "Stay sharp," Rowan's voice broke through her thoughts, a reminder to keep her focus. Arya nodded silently, her eyes narrowing as they neared the base. She could feel the weight of the situation, the knowledge that this mission was bigger than just survival. This was about proving a point, about showing that no one, no matter their rank, could escape the consequences of their actions. The base loomed ahead, a fortified structure surrounded by high fences and guard towers. Arya scanned the perimeter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She could see the movement of enemy soldiers on patrol, their faces hard and focused. They were unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. "Viper, you take the high ground," Rowan said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Provide overwatch and keep an eye on the guards. We'll move in from the south." Arya didn't hesitate. She knew her role in this: observe, report, and provide cover fire if needed. She made her way to the designated position, a rocky outcrop that gave her a perfect view of the base. From here, she could see everything. The patrols, the supply trucks moving in and out, the heavy equipment being unloaded. Everything. Her training kicked in, and she began to document the enemy's movements, her mind cataloguing every detail. Her eyes moved from one guard tower to the next, counting the personnel on each post, noting the rotations. This was her element. She was a ghost, watching, waiting, until the moment came to strike. The minutes stretched into hours as Arya remained in position, her fingers numb from the cold but steady as ever on the scope of her rifle. Her focus never wavered, even as the enemy forces below her continued their routine. But then the sound of a vehicle engine cut through the quiet. Arya shifted her gaze, following the sound of the approaching convoy. She could see the heavy military trucks moving slowly toward the base, their markings foreign but unmistakable. Prisoners. Arya's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a supply convoy. She focused on the lead vehicle, zooming in on the cargo. Her heart sank as she saw the prisoners, civilians bound and guarded, being transported like cattle. Her finger twitched on the trigger. The situation was growing more complicated by the second. This wasn't just about getting revenge on Mason. This was about something bigger. "Command, Viper," Arya whispered into her radio, her voice calm but urgent. "Convoy inbound, prisoners, possibly 15 to 20 individuals. Should I engage?" Her hand was already on the rifle, her finger itching to pull the trigger, but she knew better than to make a decision without orders. The radio crackled, Rowan's voice coming through clearly. "Maintain observation. We can't risk engaging just yet. We need to know more." Arya cursed under her breath, but she obeyed. She watched as the convoy stopped at the gate, the guards moving out to meet them. The prisoners were unloaded, their faces gaunt and fearful, some struggling against their captors. It was clear they were being brought here for labor, for whatever twisted purpose the enemy had. Arya's thoughts turned dark, but she held herself back. The mission had to come first. She continued her watch, marking every detail, calculating every possibility. The prisoners were being processed into the base, and Arya knew that if things went wrong, they would be left to die just as she had. But she couldn't stop this mission, not yet. The weight of the decision pressed on her as she adjusted her position, making sure her rifle was ready. The storm outside had only intensified, the wind howling louder as the night grew colder. But Arya was prepared. She was the White Viper, and no matter the cost, she would make sure the enemy knew what it meant to abandon their own. The storm outside seemed to match the turmoil building inside Arya as she crouched in the snow, her eyes locked on the enemy base. The faint light from the perimeter guards illuminated the chaos unfolding within the walls. The prisoners, those poor souls, were now part of something bigger than themselves, caught in the enemy's brutal grip. Arya's thoughts were clear, but the tension was unbearable. The clock was ticking. Her radio crackled again, breaking the silence. "Viper, this is Rowan. We're in position. Eyes on the depot. Move when you're ready." Arya's fingers twitched on the rifle's trigger. She could see the prisoners being herded into the facility, their hands bound and their heads lowered in submission. She couldn't let them just fade into the background of this operation, unnoticed and abandoned. But Rowan was right. This wasn't the mission. Not yet. "Understood," she whispered back, her voice cold but steady. She had a job to do. She was here to observe, to gather intel, and to wait for the signal. The weight of the task ahead seemed to grow with each passing moment. Arya shifted her position, adjusting her grip on the M210. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain. She had endured worse. Every second spent in this frozen wasteland felt like an eternity. She had already put the pieces together. The enemy forces were using the prisoners for labor, likely to fortify their positions, to further their operations. But there was more. The convoy, the guards, the prisoners. It all seemed connected to something deeper. They weren't just here for supplies, they were here to build something bigger, and Arya was going to find out what it was. "Viper, take the shot if necessary." Rowan's voice came through, but this time there was a note of caution. "We can't afford any unnecessary risks." Arya glanced through her scope once more. The prisoners were being escorted into the buildings, some stumbling with exhaustion. The guards, though alert, had no idea what was watching them from the shadows. She could almost feel the weight of their desperation, their hopelessness. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She didn't need to wait for orders anymore. She didn't need anyone's permission. The prisoners, those civilians, those innocent lives, were in her sights. They would not be forgotten. But as she prepared to take the shot, a burst of radio static broke her concentration. "Viper, hold, stand by." It was Rowan's voice, urgent, commanding. Arya's finger hovered over the trigger. What was going on? Why was Rowan calling her off? She stayed still, the rifle steady against her shoulder, every muscle in her body tense. She didn't take her eyes off the compound, not for a second. She could see movement from the corner of her eye. More guards. The perimeter was tightening. The enemy was becoming aware of something. But what? Then through the swirling snow and fading light, Arya saw it. A convoy of trucks approaching from the east. They were heavily armed, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. This was no routine supply run. This was something bigger. Arya's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the breakthrough she needed. She keyed her radio, her voice low but sharp. "Command, Viper, we've got a convoy coming in. Heavy trucks, looks like reinforcements. They're not here for supplies, they're here for something else." Her pulse raced as she kept her scope trained on the approaching vehicles. They moved slowly, deliberately. Arya knew that they weren't here by accident. These were soldiers, real soldiers, special forces perhaps. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what this meant. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence anymore. This was about stopping a larger operation before it could escalate. Rowan's voice came through, steady as ever. "Viper, stay in position. Keep watching. We'll make the call once we have all the details. No unnecessary risks." Arya clenched her jaw. She wasn't going to wait for permission this time. The mission had shifted. She had to act. The convoy was getting closer, the trucks rolling into position. She had one shot at this, and she wasn't going to miss. The convoy halted, its engines rumbling ominously in the silence of the snow-covered night. Arya's eyes never left the vehicles, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She was still in position, hidden from view, but her mind was racing. The situation had escalated faster than she anticipated. The trucks, heavily armed and fortified, had not come here for supplies or routine work. They were part of something much bigger, something that could tip the balance of this entire operation. Arya's finger hovered over the trigger, but she didn't fire. Not yet. Rowan's orders were clear. But a part of her knew this mission wasn't just about intel anymore. This was about stopping a threat before it could spread. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She could take out the lead vehicle, neutralize the threat before they had a chance to act. But it would be a calculated risk. If she was spotted, the entire operation would be compromised. And if they were bringing in reinforcements for a larger operation, there was no guarantee the SEAL team could move fast enough to prevent a full-scale assault. The tension in the air was thick. Arya could hear the muffled voices of the enemy soldiers below, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they moved toward the convoy. They were too close now. She had to decide. Her radio crackled to life. "Viper, this is Rowan. Do not engage. Hold your position." Arya's heart raced as she listened, but she didn't respond immediately. The convoy was moving again, slowly, toward the heart of the enemy base. "Understood," she whispered into the radio. But the decision had already been made. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She exhaled slowly, adjusting her position. Her target was clear. The lead vehicle was close enough now, its driver unaware of the sniper's presence. She had one shot, just one, and she would make it count. Her scope locked in, her crosshairs steady as the vehicle continued to approach. The wind was picking up again, and the snow had become a blur, but Arya's focus remained sharp. She had trained for moments like this. She had been waiting for a chance to show that she was more than just a survivor. This was her moment. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out with the force of a thunderclap, its impact resounding through the snow-covered landscape. The lead vehicle jerked to a halt, its front tires shredded by the expertly placed shutter. The convoy erupted into chaos. Guards scrambled for cover, their weapons drawn, their voices rising in panic. But Arya was already moving. She had made her move. The SEAL team would be in position to capitalize on the confusion. Arya shifted her position, staying low to the ground as she moved away from the scene. The storm was her ally once again, its swirling winds masking her movements. She could hear the shouts of the enemy soldiers as they tried to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The chaos was exactly what they needed. Arya's radio buzzed again, Rowan's voice crackling through the static. "Viper, status report. We're moving in." "Target neutralized," she replied, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "The convoy's compromised. We're in the clear." The tension in her chest began to ease, but only slightly. There was still work to be done. The enemy was reeling from the attack, but they would regroup quickly. It was time for the SEAL team to make their move. Arya checked her sidearm, ensuring it was secure. The mission had changed, but her role remained the same: to protect the team, to ensure the enemy didn't recover. As she moved back toward the rendezvous point, the storm continued to rage. But Arya felt something else now, a sense of purpose, of resolve. The team that had left her behind was now facing the consequences. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back, and when this mission was over, when the enemy had been dealt with, she would make sure they never forgot the name White Viper.